The afternoon heat at Oakridge Plantation felt like a weight pressing down on everything it touched. Catherine Marlo stood on the veranda, fanning herself and watching the long dirt road shimmer in the August sun when she saw the wagon coming. Dust rose behind it like a pale curtain, blurring the shapes on the seat until the team of horses stepped into clearer view. Her husband, Richard Marlo, sat beside the driver, gesturing excitedly with the broad, careless movements he always used when he believed he'd made a clever purchase. At first, Catherine's attention was on him, on the smug tilt of his chin, on the way he leaned forward as if he just won something. Then she saw the figure chained in the back of the wagon, and her fan stopped mid-dash air that he was impossibly large. Even sitting, shoulders hunched and wrists shackled to the wagon bed, he dwarfed the two armed men positioned on either side of him. His shoulders were so broad they seemed to swallow the sunlight behind him. His hands, heavy and bound, looked like they could crush a man's skull without effort. Yet something about him didn't match his size. His head remained bowed, his spine curled in on itself, as if he were struggling to hold himself upright. Every few seconds, a harsh, wet cough shook his chest, rattling through his frame with a sound that made Catherine think of infection, of sickness, of something wasting away from the inside. "Catherine," Richard called as the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. "Come see what I've acquired. Wait until you see the size of this one. He'll do the work of 3 men. She descended the step carefully, one gloved hand on the railing, silk skirts whispering around her ankles. She had seen many enslaved people arrive at Oakridge over the years. The plantation held 43 at present, and the routine was always the same: chains, dust, fear, exhaustion. But none of the men brought here had ever looked quite like this giant. As she approached, the man lifted his head only slightly, just enough for her to see his eyes. They were dark and alert, far too focused for someone pretending to be broken. For the briefest instant, something flickered their calculation. Cold and sharp before his gaze dropped again and another cough racked his body. "He's sick," Catherine said, instinctively stepping back. "Richard, tell me you didn't pay full price for a sick slave." Richard laughed, the sound booming across the yard. "Minor ailment, nothing more. The seller said it's just exhaustion from travel. A few days of rest and proper food, and he'll be strong as an ox. Look at him, Catherine. Those arms, those shoulders. I got him for half what he's worth because of that cough." It's the deal of the year. Catherine wasn't convinced. There was something about the giant that pressed on her nerves, a wrongness she couldn't name. Maybe it was the way his apparent weakness and his immense power sat uneasily together in the same body. Maybe it was that brief flash in his eyes, that depth that didn't belong to a simple field hand. Or instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of living on plantations, whispered that this was not a man to be taken at face value. "What's his name?" she asked. "Calls himself Jonas," Richard said, signaling to the guards. "Says he was a field hand on a South Carolina place before his master died and the property was sold off. Strong worker, no record of running, no rebellion. Perfect for our operation." The guards unfastened the chains, metal scraping against wood. The man called Jonas rose slowly, unfolding to his full height. Catherine had to tilt her head back to see his face. He must have been nearly 7 feet tall, his frame built for strength, even if his clothes hung loose from recent weight loss. He swayed, catching himself on the edge of the wagon, and one of the guards barked a laugh. "Careful, big man. Don't want to fall and hurt yourself before you've done any work." Jonas said nothing. He only nodded, shoulders rounded, eyes down, and allowed them to lead him toward the slave quarters. Catherine watched him go, unease settling in her chest like a stone. She had lived all of her 28 years inside the system of slavery, had developed a sense for who would bend, who would break, and who might someday bite the hand that held the whip. Something about this man did not fit neatly into any of those categories. He did not feel dangerous in the obvious way. He appeared too weak, too submissive, too careful for that. And yet wrong. Wrong in a way she could not explain. "You worry too much." Richard said, draping his arm around her shoulders and steering her back toward the house. He's just a big, simple field hand. Nothing to trouble yourself with. Now, come inside. I'm famished. I'm sure Bessie's got dinner ready. Catherine let herself be led, but she glanced back one last time. The giant's figure was almost swallowed by the line of cabins, his head still bowed, his step measured and slow. A shiver crawled up her spine. It felt irrationally like Richard had just brought something into their world that would not stay. Where it was put, what Catherine could not know what no white person at Oakridge Plantation could possibly imagine was that Jonas was not his name, and that the bent shoulders and rasping cough were as carefully chosen as a hunter's camouflage. His real name was Elijah. He was 32 years old, born free in the Tennessee mountains to a man who had outrun chains and a woman who had once belonged to a Georgia plantation called Oakridge. He was not a broken field hand. He was a tracker, a strategist, a man who had spent his life studying signs in the earth and people. And every tremor in his chest, every stumble in his step, every display of weakness as he crossed the yard that day was part of a plan with one. Objective.infiltration. 6 months earlier. Elijah had returned from a hunting trip to find his childhood home shattered. The cabin had been torn apart, his father Samuel barely conscious on the floor, his body broken by the fists and boots of men who carried the law on their side and cruelty in their bones. His mother, Ruth, was gone. All that remained of her was a crumpled legal notice nailed to the door. Property of Richard Marlo. Oakridge Plantation, Georgia, legally reclaimed. 20 years of freedom, erased by ink and signatures backed by the Fugitive Slave Act. Elijah had held his father while the old man wept, repeating, "I'm sorry," as if the words could bridge the distance to Georgia. Something cold and hard had taken root inside Elijah that night. His mother was in chains again because a man named Richard Marlo had decided a piece of paper gave him the right to own her. She was back on the land she had fled with a baby pressed to her chest, back in a system that turned human beings into ledger entries. Elijah knew he could not ride up to the plantation with a rifle and demand her release. He would be killed or enslaved before he even reached the front steps. So he thought like what he truly was, a hunter. A hunter doesn't chase his prey, Samuel had told him when he was a boy. He learns it, learns where it drinks, where it sleeps, where it thinks it's safe. Then he sets a trap so perfect the prey walks into it smiling. Elijah spent months gathering scraps of information, whispers from travelers, gossip in taverns, rumors from those who had passed near Oakridge. He learned that Marlowe's plantation was large, wealthy, and tightly controlled. 6 overseers armed and experienced. Bloodhounds trained for runaways. Punishments designed not just to hurt, but to frighten everyone who watched. A direct assault would be suicide. But something else began to take shape in Elijah's mind. If he could not attack from the outside, he would enter from within. Not as a free man, but as property. It took 6 months for him to dismantle himself in the way white men expected to see. He practiced the posture of submission, the slow speech, the lowered gaze. He trained his body, not to grow stronger, but to appear weaker. Then, on a cold morning near the border of slave territory, he walked alone into danger and allowed the patrol to find him. He told them he was a runaway from South Carolina, gave them a false name, let fear tremble in his voice at all the right moments. They chained him. They locked him in a slave jail in Augusta. They believed him because he had fed them exactly what they wanted, a big, simple black man who had tried and failed to escape Dot in the darkness of that jail. He began perfecting the cough that would later echo across the Oakridge yard. He irritated his throat with dust, forced his shoulders to hunch, moved as if every step cost him something. When the auction day came, he let himself be listed as questionable health, valuable for size, but discounted for risk. And when the bidding started and the crowd shifted uneasily at his rasping breath, he watched from beneath lowered lashes as one man's eyes lit up with greed. Richard Marlo. A bargain, Marlo thought. A giant at half price. A stroke of luck. Elijah only bowed his head further, chains clinking softly as the sale was completed. Inside, his mind was already walking the rows of cotton he had not yet seen, counting the overseers he had not yet met, tracing the outline of escape routes through forests he had not yet entered. By the time the wagon rolled through the gates of Oakridge and Catherine Marlo frowned from the veranda, the trap was already half built. The prey just hadn't realized it was being hunted. Elijah's first week at Oakridge was designed to break him. At dawn on his first morning, the bell clanged across the yard and the cabins emptied into gray light. Jonas, that was the only name anyone used for him, now joined the line of field. Hands marching toward the west field, his shoulders rounded, his step deliberately sluggish. The land rolled out before them in endless rows of cotton, white bowls glowing against dark soil. Around 40 enslaved men and women took their places, baskets strapped to their backs, fingers moving with grim, practiced speed. Over them on horseback rode the overseers, whips coiled at their sides, eyes always moving. The head overseer, Garrett Pike, rode straight for Elijah. Pike was a compact man with a hard face and the easy cruelty of someone who had spent his life wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. He circled Elijah slowly, looking him up and down with open disdain. "So you're the giant the master bought," Pike drawled. "Big man with a cough. Let's see if there's any work in you, or if the master paid good money for a sack of bones." Elijah kept his head down, hands loose at his sides, the picture of nervous submission. "Yes, sir," he murmured. "I'll work, sir." "You'll be in the Westfield," Pike said. "You pick from sunup to sundown. You fill your basket to the top like everyone else. You fall behind, we encourage you. You cause trouble, we break you. You run, we make an example out of you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Elijah injected a tremor of fear into his voice, just enough to satisfy Pike's ego. Then the work began. Elijah took his place at the end of a row, fingers moving over the cotton plants. It was mindless, repetitive labor. Pluck, drop, step forward, repeat. He moved slowly, coughing in regular intervals, letting sweat bead on his forehead and drip into his eyes. But beneath the performance, his hunter's mind never stopped working. He watched the overseer on horseback, tracing the rhythm of his patrol. He counted how often Pike passed each row. He noted which of the enslaved still had a spark in their gaze and which moved like hollow shells. He measured the distance from field to tree line, from field to cabins, from cabins to main house. Every detail was a piece of terrain, a pattern to be learned. By midday, his basket was only half full. The others were nearly brimming. The overseer on patrol noticed. Hooves thudded close, and a shadow fell across Elijah's bent back. "You're slow, big man," the overseer said. "Real slow for someone the master's so proud of." Elijah coughed, eyes still down. "Sorry, sir. Still feeling weak. I'll work faster." The overseer considered this for a fraction of a second, then snapped his wrist. The whip cracked across Elijah's back, fire searing through skin and muscle. Elijah flinched, but barely. He had been cut on hunts, broken bones on mountain trails, burned his hands on campfires. Pain was not new. What mattered wasn't how it felt, but how he reacted. He forced his body to remain slack, his voice to stay small. "That's to help you remember," the overseer said. "Next time I come by, that basket better be fuller." "Yes, sir," Elijah whispered. When the horse moved on, the woman in the next row glanced over. Her hands never stopped picking. Deep lines carved her brown face. Threads of gray streaked her hair. Later, he would learn her name was Abigail. "Don't let em break you first day," she murmured. "You show too much strength. They expect it every sunrise. You show too little, they beat you till there's nothing left. Pace yourself. Thank you." Elijah replied softly, and meant it. Even a single sentence of kindness mattered in a place built to strip such things away. The day stretched into something endless. The sun climbed and burned, the air thick with dust and heat. Baskets grew heavy, fingers blistered. By the time the bell rang at dusk, Elijah's back throbbed. His hands ached. And his basket was almost full, not the best, but not the worst. Good enough to avoid more lashes. The field hands trudged back to the quarters, shoulders limp with exhaustion. Elijah was placed in a rough wooden cabin with 5 other men. The room was cramped and dark, a single window warped by humidity, a few thin mattresses on the floor. "You the new giant?" one of the men asked, a middle-aged worker with a ragged scar cutting across his cheek. His name was Moses. "Yes," Elijah said simply. "Still sick," Moses snorted. "You get better fast. Master Marlo don't keep broken tools. You work, or you get sold south to the rice. Nobody comes back from there." The others grunted in agreement and lay down. One by one, their breathing deepened as sleep dragged them under. Elijah lay still, waiting. When the cabin was filled, with snores and the soft rustle of restless bodies, he slowly sat up and swung his legs to the floor. Night was the true beginning of his work. He opened the door inch by inch and slipped outside. The Georgia air was thick and hot, even in darkness. Torches burned in the distance, marking patrol routes. Dogs barked somewhere near the main house. Elijah paused, listening. Footsteps crunched over gravel as an overseer passed not far away. The pattern would be different at night, but still a pattern. There was always a pattern. He moved in the shadows between buildings, his size a challenge. To conceal, but his steps silent from years of stalking animals through underbrush. He hugged the walls of cabins, slipped behind sheds, and memorized the positions of each structure. These were his new woods. These were the paths he would one day need to navigate at speed, with others behind him. He noted the cluster of women's cabins, the faint sound of muffled weeping drifting through thin boards. Somewhere in those cramped rooms, his mother could be sleeping, or crying, or staring at the ceiling, trying not to lose herself. The urge to open each door, to search for her, clawed at him. He forced it down. A hunter didn't rush blindly toward his target. Not when the prey was watching. He found the main house, bright with lamplight, silhouettes moving behind lace-curtained windows. House slaves, working late. The overseer's cabin sat at strategic points around the yard, forming a ring of eyes and guns. Near them, he could make out the shape of a fenced kennel, the dogs. He counted the shapes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fewer than he had expected, but enough to tear an escape apart if they weren't handled correctly. Beyond everything, like a dark wall, was the forest. Thick, quiet, full of possibilities after an hour of mapping it all in his mind. Elijah slipped back into his cabin, stretched out on a thin mattress, and closed his eyes. If anyone woke, they would see only a huge man lying on his side. Faint cough rattling in his chest, the slow breathing of exhaustion. But behind his closed lids, the plantation lay in his memory as clearly as a terrain map. The days that followed settled into a brutal pattern. Bell, fields, heat, whips, baskets, nights of stolen reconnaissance. The head overseer, Pike, watched him with suspicion at first, then gradually relaxed as Elijah's performance stayed consistent, slow but improving, obedient, never answering back. The other men in the cabin began to speak more freely. Over meager evening rations, Elijah learned the shape of their fear. Master Marlo's mean but predictable. Moses said one night, chewing slowly, "You do the work he mostly leaves you be. It's the mistress you mind." Mistress Catherine, she got eyes like knives. She beat a woman once just for looking at her wrong. "She's always watching," another man muttered. "Always thinking somebody's plotting something. You can't trust her." "And the overseers?" Elijah asked, keeping his tone idle, like a man trying to understand the rules that governed his survival. 6, Moses replied. "Pike's the worst. Then Turner, Crawford, Bennett, Hayes, and that new one, Dalton. All of them got guns. All of them know how to use them." "And the dogs?" 5 bloodhounds, Moses said grimly. "Trained to run down anybody who tries to leave. Last man who ran, they brought him back half dead." Master Marlo finished the job, then sold his body south just to prove a point. Folks don't run from Oakridge no more. Elijah listened and nodded. Outwardly, just another tired slave absorbing the plantation's grim logic. Inwardly, he was sorting the information, arranging it beside the map in his mind. 6 overseers, 5 dogs, 43 enslaved people. Fields, forests, cabins, main house, stables, a closed system, a cage. On the 3rd day, during the brief midday break when the field hands crowded around the water barrel, something in the adjacent field caught his eye. A woman bent over the plants, moving with a familiar mixture of grace and weariness. Her hair, darker now and threaded with gray, was pulled back in a way he remembered from childhood. The sun caught her profile, and for a heartbeat, time fell away. Ruth, not his mother. Every instinct in Elijah screamed at him to go to her, to call her name, to drop the mask and run. Instead, he tightened his grip on his tin cup and kept his feet planted. Overseers watched from horseback. Any sudden movement, any visible recognition, would be noted and remembered. Connections got people punished. Connections got people sold. He swallowed the surge of emotion like he'd swallowed mountain air on winter mornings. Sharp, burning, necessary. She was alive. She was here. That alone was enough to steady him. He could work with alive. That night, as he lay on the hard mattress staring at the shadowed ceiling, the outline of his mission sharpened. He had confirmed what he needed to know. His mother was on the plantation, security was tight but predictable, and the people around him were exhausted, frightened, and conditioned not to believe in escape. He would have to move slowly, earn trust, find allies who still had enough hope left to risk everything. He had entered Oakridge as property. Now he began, in earnest, the quiet work of becoming its most dangerous enemy. Sunday afternoon was the only mercy Oakridge Plantation ever offered. It wasn't freedom, nothing like freedom, but it was the one window of time when the enslaved could sit, breathe, speak without an overseer's shadow, crossing their path every few minutes. Work was paused. Whips were still. Overseers lounged or disappeared into the main house for food and drink. And on that first Sunday after his arrival, Elijah finally saw his moment. He had spent the entire week studying the plantation, memorizing every face and every footstep. He had counted overseers' horses, memorized the sound of each dog's bark, and learned which workers moved with resignation and which still carried a spark behind their eyes. He had mapped escape routes in the dirt with his fingertip at night, over and over until the pattern was etched in his memory like a trail worn into the earth. But all of that was just preparation. The real mission, the only mission, was his mother. He had seen her 3 days earlier in the adjacent field, and the image had burned into him like a brand. Every night since, he had replayed that moment. Her bent shoulders, her worn hands, her gray threaded hair, her survival, her suffering. His responsibility. This Sunday, he approached the women's quarters with cautious steps. He kept to the shadows, maintaining the careful posture of the giant named Jonas, slow, hesitant, sick. He passed groups of people sitting quietly, some singing low hymns, some simply resting. He nodded at them respectfully, playing the role so deeply that even he almost believed it. Behind the last cabin, near a small patch of vegetables growing in uneven rows, he saw her. Ruth knelt in the soil, her hands working automatically, pulling weeds and trimming the leaves of wilted plants. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her back curved from years of toil. But she was alive, and she was alone. He approached quietly, stopping just close enough that she heard his footsteps. She didn't turn. "What is it?" she asked without looking up. "If you need vegetables, come back later." "I haven't finished, Mama," Elijah said softly. Her hands froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a full second she didn't move, as if her body refused to believe what her mind had just heard. Then she turned. The transformation of her face was almost too painful to watch. Shock, recognition, joy, fear. Pure terror. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, Elijah." No, you can't be here. She surged forward, gripping his arms with urgent, trembling hands. What have you done? What have you done? He pulled her gently into a shadowed corner behind a stack of empty baskets, away from the windows of the cabins. I came for you, he said simply. I'm going to take you home. Ruth shook her head desperately. Elijah, listen to me. You leave tonight. You run before they realize you don't belong here. Do you understand me? They'll kill you if they find out. They'll kill you and brag about it. They won't find out. They will. She hissed. This place is a cage with eyes. 6 overseers, dogs, patrols day and night. Richard Marlo has friends in 3 counties. Even if you escaped, they'd catch you before sunrise. Elijah, please go. He held her shoulders, steadying her. Mama, I'm not the boy you carried north. I'm not the boy who went hunting with Papa in the hills. I'm a grown man, a hunter, and I've been watching this place since the moment I arrived. Ruth stared at him, breathing hard. She saw the truth in his eyes, the hard calculation, the quiet resolve. Not recklessness. Strategy. How? She whispered, I let myself be captured, he said. I pretended to be a runaway from South Carolina. I became what they wanted to see. And they brought me here. Ruth closed her eyes, pained. To save me. You let them chain you. I came because they chained you, he answered, her eyes filled with tears. She brushed his cheek with trembling fingers, the motion half maternal, half grieving. Elijah, what are you planning? He leaned in close. I need information. Everything you know about Marlo, the house. The routines? Anything that could help. I'm building a plan, but I need your piece of it. Ruth hesitated, glancing around. No overseers nearby. Voices were distant. For a few precious minutes, they were unseen. She swallowed and began. Richard Marlo leaves once every 3 months for Savannah, she said. He'll be gone a day next month. Catherine runs the house while he's away, but she's too suspicious. You must avoid her. She already watches me, Elijah admitted. Ruth nodded grimly. She always watches the one she doesn't trust. She continued, her voice low and urgent. The overseers rotate at night. 2 patrol while the others sleep. The bloodhounds are kept in a locked kennel behind their cabins. They're fed at sundown, always by the youngest overseer. And she paused, hesitating. There is one night each year when the plantation becomes careless. When? The harvest celebration, Ruth whispered. Marlo invites every plantation owner he knows. The overseers drink. The house slaves are overworked. The patrols get sloppy. Sometimes they forget whole sections of the quarters. When is it? 6 weeks? Elijah exhaled slowly. 6 weeks? Enough time to prepare? Enough time to gather allies? Enough time to build the kind of plan that would not just free him and Ruth, but anyone brave enough to follow? Then that's when we move, he said. We? She echoed softly. Elijah, we can't save everyone. Not everyone, he said. But not just us either. There are still people here who have fight left in them. They deserve a chance. Ruth's eyes filled again, this time not just with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. You sound like your father, she whispered. Benny raised me right, Elijah replied. They talked for several minutes more, disguised as mother and son tending a vegetable patch. Ruth described the layout of the main house, including the study where Marlo kept his weapons and documents. She told him which overseers drank the most, which were the laziest, which were the cruelest. She described Catherine's habits, the way she rode along the fields with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She revealed patrol schedules, the feeding routine of the dogs. The ring of keys Marlo wore around his neck. Elijah absorbed it all. When they finally parted, Ruth squeezed his hand once. Hard. Don't die for me, she said. I'm not dying, Elijah said softly. I'm hunting. That night, on his thin mattress in the men's cabin, Elijah let himself smile for the first time since stepping onto the plantation. The conversation had been short, risky, terrifying, but it had given him everything he needed. To begin shaping a plan worthy of the man who taught him how to move through the woods without leaving a sound. The trap had begun to take form. And Oakridge Plantation had no idea that its days were numbered. 6 weeks remained until the harvest celebration, the single night. Elijah believed they had a real chance at freedom. But 6 weeks on a plantation was a lifetime. Each day brought new risks, new eyes watching him, new chances for everything to collapse before it could begin. And the greatest risk of all was Catherine Marlo. While Richard was boastful, predictable, and blinded by arrogance, Catherine was something else entirely: sharp, observant, and possessed of an instinct Elijah could almost feel brushing against him like cold fingers. By the middle of his 4th week at Oakridge, he noticed something unmistakable. She was watching him, not casually, not out of idle curiosity, studying him one blistering afternoon. While the field hands worked under the sun's unrelenting glare, Catherine arrived on horseback. Her Maris hooves kicked up dust as she rode between the rows, glancing over baskets and workers with that sharp, calculating gaze. Some of the enslaved lowered their eyes instantly. Some tensed. Others froze like animals sensing a predator. Elijah kept his posture slumped, shoulders sagging, breath rattling on cue. He coughed at just the right moment, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as if exhausted. But Catherine did not ride past him. She stopped. "Jonas," she said. He flinched subtly, as any beaten-down slave would. "Yes, ma'am. Look at me." Slowly, Elijah lifted his eyes. He made sure they appeared dull, hesitant, obedient, never sharp enough to reflect the truth. Catherine studied him for so long he felt sweat bead beneath his collar. "You're stronger now," she observed. "Your picking has improved. Your posture, too." "Yes, ma'am." "Feeling better?" "Ma'am," he said, voice small. Her gaze narrowed. How convenient. His heart beat once, hard, but his face never changed. She tilted her head, examining him like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "There's something about you," she murmured. "Something I can't place." Elijah lowered his eyes. "Just working hard, ma'am. Don't want to be sold south." That struck a chord. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. "Yes, fear is useful. It keeps you obedient." That evening, Elijah met with Ruth behind the vegetable garden, both pretending to tend the plants as overseers passed lazily nearby. "She's studying me," Elijah said quietly. "She feels something off." Ruth's shoulders stiffened. Catherine always feels when something's off. That woman sees danger in every shadow. "That's exactly the problem," Elijah answered. "She watches the one she can't read." "What if she convinces Richard to sell you?" Ruth whispered, fear tightening her voice. "What if she thinks you're trouble and sends you south before your plan is ready?" Elijah shook his head. "Richard won't sell me. Not after bragging about getting me cheap. Not while I am producing a basket a day. Greed will override her suspicions." Ruth hesitated, then nodded. "You're right about him. But Catherine, be careful. She's not like the others." "I know," Elijah murmured. He knew all too well. During the 5th week, Catherine's suspicion escalated. She appeared in the fields more often. She dismounted her horse sometimes and walked between the rows, observing the workers up close. Elijah noticed her watching him even when she pretended to be focused on someone else. Once, she rode directly past him, then doubled back abruptly. Another day. She lingered so long that the overseers began to exchange glances. And then came the moment he had feared. It was early morning. Mist still clinging to the ground. The field hands were not 10 minutes into work when Catherine rode up behind Elijah without warning. "Jonas," she said sharply. He turned slowly, shoulders hunched. "Let me see your hands." He hesitated just enough to register fear, not suspicion, and held them up. She took one hand in her glove, turning it to inspect the calluses. Too many for a sick man, too thick for a field hand, too weak to do heavy work, too even and precise for someone who supposedly spent his life on a single plantation. "They healed fast," she said softly. Elijah lowered his eyes. "Picking hard, ma'am. Hands get tough, ma'am." Her eyes stayed on his fingers far longer than necessary. Then she looked at his shoulders. His posture dot his cough, which had begun to fade faster than he intended. "You're recovering quickly," she said. Voice cool. "Yes, man. You must be stronger than you look." "No." Mm, mm, mm. She released his hand. The mare backed up with a snort, and Catherine turned toward the main house. But for the first time, Elijah felt a tremor of real danger settle low in his stomach. God, she knew something. She didn't know what. Not yet, but she knew something. That night, Elijah met Abigail near the water barrels. "She's watching you like a hawk," Abigail warned. "Been doing it for days?" "I know," Elijah replied. "Don't give her reason," Abigail whispered. "If she can't figure you out, she'll break you just to see what's inside." "I won't slip," he said. "I can't." "You better not," she murmured. "A whole lot of people are counting on you without even knowing it." Despite the increasing tension, Elijah continued gathering allies. He started discreetly, cautiously, choosing people who still had steel in their spines. Samuel, the young man with grief in his eyes after losing his wife. Clara, the house slave with access to information. Moses, who had seen enough cruelty to hate his captors without fear numbing him. Hannah, who worked in the kitchen and moved unnoticed through the plantation's most guarded spaces. 5 people, smart, steady, trustworthy. He never told them everything at once. Only pieces. Enough to test their courage. Enough to judge their resolve by the end of the 5th week. He had them, a small circle of people willing to risk their lives for freedom, and though Catherine's eyes stayed locked on him, Elijah comforted himself with one truth. Suspicion was not proof, and suspicion alone could not stop what was coming. Because soon, the harvest celebration would arrive, and on that night, the one night when white men on the plantation would drown their vigilance, and whiskey and Pride Elijah would spring the trap, a trap he had been building, layer by layer, under the very glare of the woman who sensed the storm but could not see its shape. Trap that would turn Oakridge Plantation upside down, and Catherine Marlo, for all her sharpness, wouldn't be able to stop it. 6 days remained until the harvest celebration, and Elijah felt every hour tightening around him like a snare. The plantation bustled with growing tension fields, still being cleared, barns being organized, house slaves preparing linens and silverware, but beneath all of that activity ran an undercurrent he alone noticed. The overseers were. Distracted. Richard Marlo is busy entertaining visiting planters and boasting about the upcoming celebration, and Catherine watched him. Yes, but she was watching everyone else too. Her suspicion had broadened into a general anxiety about the event. That gave Elijah space. Not safety. Never safety. But space. In space was enough. The plan had required patience. But now it needed precision. Over the next 3 days, Elijah began turning the 5 allies he'd gathered into something more. Coordinated team. He started with Abigail. They sat behind the weaving shed after sundown, both pretending to mend tools as shadows deepened around them. "I need you to watch the older ones," Elijah told her. Quietly. "Those too weak to travel. We can't take them." Abigail nodded grimly. "Ain't no shame in survival," she said. "Some folks can't make the run. But those who can, we'll make sure they're ready." Then Samuel approached, his young face tight with determination that didn't match his exhaustion. "What about weapons?" he asked. "We'll need something." Elijah shook his head. "No blades. No guns. Nothing that leaves blood behind. We're escaping, not fighting a war." Samuel clenched his jaw. "I want to make them pay." "You will?" Elijah said softly. "By taking your freedom." Samuel swallowed hard. Then nodded. Next came Clara, slipping from the main house after finishing her duties. She carried quiet confidence, one Elijah trusted more than any blade. "I know Marlo's routine for the night of the celebration," she whispered. "He'll be drinking hard. He always does. And his overseers, they'll want to impress the guests. They'll be drunk too." "Then that's when we move," Elijah said. "Timing will decide everything." Clara nodded and leaned in. One more thing. He keeps the key to his study, the ledger, the weapons, and a chain around his neck. You'll need it. Elijah's jaw tightened. Then I'll take it. Clara gave him a long, steady look. Be careful. Drunken men can be more dangerous than sober ones. On the fourth day before the celebration, Elijah met Hannah in the kitchen, under the warm glow of lantern light. She was slicing onions, tears running down her cheeks, not from emotion, but from the sting of the work. You said you need access to medicines? She murmured, yes, Elijah said quietly. Laudanum, especially. Hannah wiped her face. I can get it. Mistress keeps it in a lockbox for her headaches. And the dogs... Yes, Elijah finished. The dogs will eat at sunset. That's when they'll dose their food. Hannah hesitated. It won't kill them, right? No, Elijah promised. We don't punish animals for the sins of the men who train them. Hannah nodded, relieved. And the horses? Elijah asked. That'll be on Samuel, she said. He knows the stables well. They trust him with the feed sometimes. Elijah smiled. Good, that's the second part of the trap. That night, Elijah returned to his cabin and lay awake, listening to the slow breaths of the sleeping men around him. He replayed every step of the plan in his mind, every timing window, every blind spot, every opportunity. There were cracks, no plan was perfect. But it was strong enough, stronger than anything this plantation had ever faced. And there was something else, a growing sense that the people around him, broken as they were, had started to believe. Not fully. Not yet. But the way they moved, the way they glanced at him, the way they avoided speaking aloud but lingered a moment longer in his presence. Hope was blooming quietly, carefully. But it was there 2 days before the celebration. Elijah saw Ruth again. They pretended to cross paths by accident, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Elijah, she whispered urgently. You need to know, Catherine has been asking questions. She told Marlo she thinks you're hiding something. Did he believe her? Elijah asked. No, Ruth said. He thinks she's imagining things. But she's watching you more closely now. Elijah exhaled slowly. Her eyes won't matter once the music starts on celebration night. Ruth shook her head. Just be careful. Catherine is dangerous in her own way. I know, he said. But this is happening, Mama. The wheels are already turning. She squeezed his arm. Your father would be proud? And for the first time since stepping onto Oakridge soil, Elijah felt the ghost of Samuel beside him, steadying him, reminding him that a hunter's greatest weapon wasn't strength or speed, it was patience. The night before the celebration, the final piece of the plan fell into place information. Elijah needed desperately. Moses approached him in the darkness behind the cabins, his voice low. I've listened to the overseers talk, Moses said. They're splitting duties. Pike, Turner, and Crawford will stay at the party. Bennett Hayes and that new one, Dalton, will do the patrols. How many cabins will they check? Elijah asked. All of them, Moses replied. But sloppy? They don't like leaving the party. And the timing? Every half hour. No more. That was better than Elijah had hoped. One night, one window, one chance. Everything was ready. Everything, except the part no one could predict. Human fear, human hesitation, human fate. As the plantation fell into restless silence that night, Elijah whispered into the darkness, more to himself than anyone else. Tomorrow night, Oakridge learns what happens when it hunts the wrong man. Because Jonas the slave was a lie, Elijah the hunter was real, and now the trap he had built piece by piece was ready to spring. The morning of the harvest celebration arrived thick with humidity and tension. Oakridge Plantation buzzed like a disturbed beehive house, slaves rushing in and out of the kitchen. Men hauling barrels of cider, overseers barking orders, and Catherine Marlo stalking the property with her, sharp eyes darting from detail to detail, as if the entire celebration was a test she meant to personally pass. Elijah watched everything with the quiet stillness of a man waiting for the first card in a Stack deck to fall. This was the day. By sundown. Everything would be in motion. And by midnight, Oakridge would never be the same again. For the field hands, the morning was shorter than usual. Work ended by noon so they could be cleared from the paths and roads leading to the big house. The overseers didn't want guests seeing tired. Dusty slaves wandering about. At 4 o'clock, the cabins filled with murmurs of dread and whispered prayers. The slaves were forbidden to leave the quarters, warned that any movement toward the main house would result in punishment. Elijah sat among them, appearing calm while inside every second felt like a countdown. Hannah slipped in quietly, a tray in her hands. She distributed cups of water as if performing a kindness, but when she reached Elijah, she paused. It's done. She whispered. The laudanum. The dogs. Phase 1, complete. At exactly 5 o'clock. Carriages began arriving. Wheels crunched over the gravel driveway, horses snorted, and rich laughter floated toward the cabins. Elijah could picture it without seeing it, the guests stepping out in fancy coats and dresses. The air filling with perfume and cigar smoke. By 6. Music drifted into the night. Violins, laughter. The ring of silver dishes. It was beginning. Elijah stood and stretched, pretending to settle down for the night. Moses gave him a tense nod. Samuel cracked his knuckles, and Abigail murmured a prayer under her breath. The patrols had started, every 30 minutes. Just as expected. At 7:15 p.m. Clara slipped away from the main house under the guise of fetching more wine glasses. She found Elijah near the water barrels behind the cabins. They dosed the dogs' food at sundown. She whispered, I passed by the kennels. They're quiet. Too quiet? Elijah nodded. Good. And the overseers? Pike, Turner, and Crawford are at the party, Clara said. Drunk already? Bennett and Hayes are doing lazy patrols. Dalton. He's barely awake on his feet. Even better. And Marlo? Elijah asked. Already bragging, Clara said. Already drunk. Perfect. Did Catherine say anything? Yes. Clara swallowed. She's tense. Watching everyone. But she's busy. She won't leave the house tonight. That was the best news of all. Catherine was the only real threat tonight. But she would be pinned inside the party, trapped by her own need to impress at 8 p.m. Elijah made his move. He approached the kitchen door, knocking softly. Hannah opened it, sweat beading her forehead from hours over the stove. You sure you're ready? She asked. Yes, Elijah said, his low, careful voice. Mistress Catherine might need help? Hannah nodded nervously. She probably will. They're running out of men to move chairs. She stepped aside. Elijah walked into the main house. The heat of the kitchen hit him, first steam rising from pots. The hiss of pans, clattering plates. But beyond that, down the hall he could already hear the party. Loud voices, clinking glasses, drunken laughter. Catherine swept into the kitchen, nearly colliding with Elijah. What are you doing here? She snapped. Hannah jumped in. Man, we need extra hands. Jonas offered. Strong back, Catherine's eyes narrowed at Elijah. He lowered his gaze. For 5 long seconds. She studied him, every breath, every tremor, every angle of his posture. Finally, with a sharp wave of her hand, she said, Fine. Move the chairs in the east parlor. Clara appeared at Elijah's side, guiding him through the bustling rooms as if he were just another servant filling Catherine Marlo's demands. Elijah lifted chairs, carried trays, lit lanterns, and refilled wine carefully, staying within his role. He blended into the household chaos like one more piece of furniture, but his eyes were always calculating. Watching. Waiting. At 9 p.m. Richard Marlo spotted him. There he is. Marlo slurred loudly, pointing at Elijah with a cigar. That's the giant I bought for half price. Look at him, strong as a bull now. The guest turned, voices rising in admiration and amusement. Elijah bowed his head. Expression neutral. Just another piece of property. Just what he needed to be. Marlo motioned for him to serve drinks. Perfect. Elijah moved through the crowd. Tray in hand, studying the room for weaknesses. Pike was slumped in a chair. Red-faced and glassy dash-eyed. Turner was loudly arguing with. Planter about cotton prices. Crawford was asleep in a corner. Elijah almost smiled. They couldn't guard a chicken. Coop in their condition dot at 9:30. Clara dropped her tray accidentally, glass shattering across the room, a planned distraction. While everyone shouted and cleaned up the mess, Elijah slipped quietly into the hallway. The study, the heart of the plan. He reached the locked door and pulled the thin strip of metal from his boot. 30 seconds later, the lock clicked open. Inside the study, the smell of paper, ink, and whiskey filled the air. Moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating the cabinet where Marlo kept the ledger dot locked, dot as expected. Elijah pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door frame briefly. He needed the key, dot the key around Marlo's neck, dot no choice but to take it. He returned to the main room at 10 p.m., finding Marlo swaying drunkenly, his speech nearly incoherent. Elijah stepped forward with a decanter of wine. "More wine, master," he said. Marlo shoved his glass forward. Elijah poured, accidentally spilled some onto Marlo's jacket. Marlo roared. "You clumsy animal." Elijah, bowing quickly. "I'm sorry, master. Let me clean it. Quick, so it doesn't stain." Clara appeared instantly with a cloth. Together, they maneuvered Marlo into a washroom. He rambled and cursed while Clara worked on the jacket. When he lifted his head to shout at her, Elijah moved behind him, quick. Practiced hands sliding around the chain at his neck dot snap dot chain broken. Key captured. Marlo never. Notice dot Elijah slipped it into his pocket dot Clara gave the smallest. Nod dot it was timed out at 10:15. Elijah returned to the study alone. He unlocked the cabinet and pulled out the leather ledger. The document that named every slave on the plantation, the blueprint for recapture. Without it, they would be ghosts. He opened the ink pot and began destroying it, changing names, altering ages, switching descriptions. Every stroke of the pen made them freer. Then he found something else, a loaded pistol, a bag of coins dot insurance dot. He pocketed both, finally. He tore out the pages belonging to his mother, his allies, and himself when he closed the cabinet. The ledger was useless. Oakridge Plantation no longer owned them on paper. The chains had cracked. The trap was set at 11 p.m. He quietly slipped out of the kitchen, moving toward the cabins. The patrol had just passed. 25 minutes, enough time till he reached the quarters. All 7 were waiting: Ruth, Abigail, Moses, Samuel, Hannah, Clara, and one more man who had asked to join. They had their bundles ready. "The dogs?" Elijah asked. "Asleep," Hannah whispered. "Ours now? The horses?" "Gone," Samuel said, with a grin. "Running through the fields like they've been waiting their whole lives." "And the ledger?" Ruth whispered. "Destroyed," Elijah said. "They'll be chasing phantoms." Moses nodded. "The patrol won't be back for 20 minutes. Elijah looked at all of them, faces tight with fear, but illuminated by something stronger. Determination. Double quotes. Then we go, he said. Now, 8 souls stepped into the darkness, 8 sparks in the night, heading toward the forest, toward the creek, toward Tennessee, toward freedom. Behind them, the lights of the party glowed like stars. Ahead of them, the forest opened its arms. Elijah breathed once, deeply. "Stay close. Stay silent. Follow me." And the hunter led them into the night, into the first steps of a journey that would test every shred of courage they possessed. Oakridge Plantation still danced and drank and laughed behind them, but its empire had already begun to fall. The first hour after leaving Oakridge Plantation was the most dangerous, and every step felt like walking on a blade. Elijah led the group through the trees with the confidence of a man who knew every root and ditch in the dark. He had walked this route in his mind countless times. Now he walked it with 7 lives depending on him, not including his own. Behind him, Ruth breathed in strained whispers, her hands trembling, but her stride determined. Abigail limped slightly, but refused help. Samuel kept scanning their rear. muscles tense as if expecting overseers to burst from the darkness at any moment. Moses moved like a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. Clara and Hannah clutched their small bundles, their faces pale in the moonlight yet full of resolve. The forest swallowed them whole, branches closing overhead in a canopy that blocked the moonlight. Elijah took them toward the shallow creek he had discovered during his nighttime scouting. Water made tracking difficult for dogs, even bloodhounds. He stepped into the creek first, cold water rising to his ankles, and motioned for the others to follow. They waded upstream, the current whispering against their legs. The sound masked their footsteps, and the water washed away their scent. If the dog awoke before dawn and Elijah prayed the hounds would struggle to follow them by the time they reached a bend in the creek. The group was shivering. Elijah led them onto the bank, into a thick patch of brush. "We rest here," he whispered. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, dawn approaching. Ruth collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. Abigail leaned against a tree, breathing hard. Elijah crouched at the edge of the brush, watching the horizon. "They'll discover we're gone soon," he murmured. Moses nodded grimly. "They'll lose their minds." Back at the plantation, Elijah imagined the chaos. Drunken overseers jolting awake. The scattered horses, the silent dogs, the corrupted ledger. Confusion would reign before coordination. They had hours, precious hours, but not many as sunlight crept through the trees. Elijah motioned everyone deeper into the foliage. "We stay hidden through the day," he said. "No fires, no talking, no movement." They settled into the earth like hunted animals, sleep dragging at their eyelids. One by one, they drifted off, except Elijah and Samuel, who took turns keeping watch. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made Elijah's hand go to the pistol hidden beneath his shirt. Afternoon crawled by in suffocating silence. Each hour felt like a lifetime. When dusk finally cooled the air, Elijah roused the group. "We move again." Their feet were swollen, blisters raw, but fear kept them upright. They traveled north under cover of night, guided by the North Star and the twist of the river. Elijah's father had taught him wilderness survival not for escape, but for living. Now, those skills became the difference between life and death. He found edible berries, checked the wind direction to avoid smoke from distant cabins, and recognized the faint markings carved into trees by underground railroad. Guides coded signs pointing toward safety. On the second night, they heard dogs in the distance. The sound stopped everyone cold. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Elijah knelt and listened. The barking was sporadic, confused. "They've lost the trail," he whispered. The laudanum slowed them. "The creek broke our scent." Relief washed over the group like a blessing. On the third night, they crossed into Tennessee. Elijah paused at the border of the state he had once called home. His childhood memories flickered through his mind, his father's laugh, the smell of fresh pine, the cabin where he had lived free. His mother touched his arm gently. "You brought me back," she whispered. "You kept your promise?" Elijah nodded, though his chest tightened with the knowledge that they still had far to go. 6 nights in. They reached their first safe house, a small farm owned by a Quaker family who asked nothing, said little, and provided everything. Fresh water, warm bread, soft blankets, and directions to the next station. The group rested there a single night before moving on. Elijah could see how the journey had worn them down. Abigail's steps slower, Moses' breath heavier, Ruth's shoulders drooping. But none complained. Freedom pulled them forward. By the 12th night, Kentucky welcomed them with rolling hills and cold winds. They slept in barns, caves, and once in the hollow of an old fallen oak. They traveled by starlight, breathed in fear, whispered prayers under their breath. Freedom was close enough to taste. Yet danger still lurked in every shadow. That then came the 23rd morning after their escape, a cold October dawn. Mist curled over the surface of the Ohio River as they approached it. The water glimmered like a silver path stretching into another world. Elijah stood at the riverbank, emotion tightening his throat. "This is it," he said softly. "Once we cross, We're free. They used a small rowboat provided by a conductor of the Underground Railroad. 8 people stepped in, their hearts pounding as the river carried them across. When the boat touched the opposite shore, Ruth sank to her knees and wept. Abigail lifted her face to the sky. Samuel let out a long, trembling breath. Clara took Hannah's hand. Moses whispered a quiet hallelujah. Elijah stepped onto the soil of free territory lost. He looked back at the river that separated bondage from freedom and let the weight of everything settle in his chest. The fear, the risk, the courage, the impossible triumph. They had done it. They were free. But freedom wasn't just a destination. It was a truth they had claimed with their own hands against a system designed to crush them. And Elijah, the hunter who infiltrated a plantation, disguised as prey, knew this was only the beginning of their new lives. The chains of Oakridge Plantation were behind them. The open world was before them. And for the first time since stepping onto Georgia soil, Elijah allowed himself to believe they had truly escaped. Years later, when Elijah's hair had turned silver and his hands carried the scars of both bondage and freedom, he often sat on the porch of his small Canadian home with his grandchildren gathered around his feet. They adored him, not because he towered over every other man in town, not because he could still track a deer through dense forest at 70 years old, and not because he carried a quiet intensity that made even grown men fall silent when he spoke. They adored him because he told stories. Stories of wilderness, of family, of survival. But there was one story he never began until the youngest child had fallen asleep and the oldest had asked 3 times for the truth of how he once walked into the jaws of slavery pretending to be prey, while secretly hunting the men who believed they owned him. He always started with a warning. "This ain't a story about glory," he would say. "It's a story about courage and fear and how a man can lose himself or find himself when the world tries to break him." Then he told them how he had watched overseers fall into chaos when they discovered 8 enslaved people missing on the morning after the harvest celebration. How Richard Marlo had stumbled into the yard, raging, shouting orders, swearing vengeance. How Catherine Marlo had stood on the veranda, her face pale, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white, because she had known deep in the cold center of her instinct that Jonas wasn't Jonas at all. He told his grandchildren how Oakridge Plantation became a storm of confusion. Overseers shouting, horses scattered through the fields, dogs lying unconscious, unable to track. The corrupted ledger causing panic among slave catchers who no longer knew who they were chasing. How it took them nearly a day to organize a pursuit, and by then, he and the others were already 15 miles ahead. Deep in terrain no horseman could navigate at speed. He described the journey north, how they waded through creeks, hid in ravines, slept in brush piles, and walked every night until their feet bled. He told them how Abigail kept them calm with hymns whispered under her breath. How Moses refused to rest on the nights when fear clawed at the group's resolve. How Clara knew which small towns to avoid. How Hannah risked her life for laudanum that saved them from the dogs. And how Ruth, his mother, walked beside him every step, even when her legs trembled with exhaustion. He told them about the safe houses, the coded messages carved into trees, the farmers and abolitionists who opened their doors without asking names. He told them about the freezing river crossing and the moment Ruth fell to her knees on free soil, sobbing with relief. Sometimes, when he reached that part, Elijah would pause, staring into the distance as if still hearing the sound of water hitting the boat's wooden hull. "That was the first breath of freedom I ever took," he would say softly. "The first real one. And it tasted like cold river air and my mother's tears." But he did not shy away from what happened after Richard Marlowe's reputation had crumbled. Plantation owners in the county whispered behind his back, mocking him for losing 8. Enslaved people mocking the idea that a supposedly simple-minded field hand had outsmarted him every turn. Marlo grew bitter, paranoid, and crueler than before. Oakridge Plantation lost money, lost labor, lost status. Marlo never recovered. Catherine Marlo lived the rest of her life with a quiet torment because she had been right. Her instincts had screamed about Jonas from the moment she saw him. She had watched him more closely than anyone else on the plantation. And yet she still failed to stop the storm she sensed coming. Her failure became a wound she carried long after the plantation itself began to rot. As for the other overseers, their arrogance followed them like a curse. Some were fired, some left. Some stayed, sinking deeper into the cruelty that had always defined them. But the legend of Oakridge's escape spread far beyond the plantation's borders, not as a whisper, not as a spark. Elijah made sure his grandchildren understood one thing above all. That escape wasn't just ours, he said. It belonged to every man and woman who ever believed freedom was impossible. It proved that even in the darkest place, even when the world tells you you're nothing, you can fight back. He described how enslaved people across Georgia told the story in hushed voices. The giant who wasn't weak, the hunter who pretended to be sick, the man who let himself be enslaved to free his mother. The legend traveled faster than overseers could stamp it out. Some said the story was impossible. Some said it was dangerous. But it spread anyway. A whispered reminder of something that terrified slave owners more than anything else. The enslaved were thinking, planning, resisting. Elijah eventually settled in Canada, where he married, raised children, and built a life his younger self could barely have imagined. Ruth lived long enough to see emancipation, long enough to see the country change, long enough to die free. Abigail lived with a Quaker family and helped other runaways reach safety. Moses, Samuel, Clara, and Hannah all made new lives different but free. They never forgot Oakridge. They never forgot the night they walked away from chains. And they never forgot the man who led them. On the quiet porch in Canada, with the cold wind carrying the scent of pine, Elijah leaned back in his chair and looked at his grandchildren with a gentle, tired smile. "You want to know the real lesson?" he asked. "The one your great-grandmother taught me the night I found her on that plantation." The children leaned closer. "The people who enslaved us wanted us to think we were powerless," he said. "Wanted us to forget we had minds and hearts and fight left in us. But they were wrong. We weren't property. We weren't animals. We were human beings." He touched his chest. "And freedom is a thing you carry in here long before you ever get to taste it." His grandchildren listened in awe. And in that moment, the story of Oakridge became more than a tale of escape. It became a legacy, a warning, and a promise. Because Elijah the hunter had infiltrated a nightmare and walked out with 8 souls behind him. And the world would never forget it.